We have new bulletins, so be sure to pick one up. And if you have any updates on those, why, let Michael know, and he'll update it and announce the announcements tonight. Glad to have Brother Jerry able to be back with us tonight as well. Appreciate all of you being here. And Barry, come and lead us and get us started.
There it is. Well, hello, everybody. It is good to see everybody out tonight. It's good to be here. It's actually been a little while since I've been able to be here on a Wednesday night. With Maisie starting kindergarten and doing an after-school program, and Hannah working later and later, we usually are pushing it to make it on time in Baxter on Wednesday nights, and hence why they're not with me tonight. Hannah didn't get off work in time. So I'm here by myself. It's good to be with you, and because I haven't been here in a while, I have missed a good majority of this summer series. I'm sure, knowing the men that have done it, that they've been some excellent lessons, and I say that to say that should I repeat something that's been pounded into the ground or something of that nature, then I apologize, but I do have plausible deniability of it. And another thing, of course, we're studying the book of Acts through this book by Brother Winkler, The Church We Love. And this is actually, me and Justin have been using this book with the teenagers downstairs for the last couple months, and it's a great book. For those of you that haven't had a chance to look through it, it kind of breaks it down, and typically it takes like a chapter of the book, and it'll break it down with the lesson that may be in there. With this lesson tonight, it starts about halfway through the 21st chapter and goes through the end of the book, which is 28 chapters, 7.5 chapters. And typically with a lesson that's based so much on this, I would read it in case everybody hasn't had a chance to read it recently. But since it is 7.5 chapters, and as slow as I read, I will bypass that tonight. But I would encourage you, if you haven't recently, go back and read these last, like I said, starting in chapter 21, about halfway through, and then all the way back through the end of Acts. But our topic tonight, and I will go through and give kind of a brief, well, not really brief, but brief comparatively synopsis of what's going on here in a minute. But the topic tonight is tradition, and how tradition can challenge the church we love. What do we think about when we think about tradition? When I first started getting ready for this lesson, I couldn't help, but the first thing that came to my mind was Jim Nance's voice, talking about the Masters Golf Tournament, a tradition unlike any other. And we use those words a lot with sports and things that happen every year. But really, when we think about it, and a lot of times we don't think about it, we use tradition daily, on a daily basis, in pretty much every facet of our lives. A lot of times when we think about tradition, we'll think about religious matters, and we'll think about, a great sports rivalry that happens every year, but really, every facet of our lives. We get in routine sometimes where we create our own traditions. When I go somewhere, I'm going to do this, and because I do it every time. There's really no reason why you do it. You just do it every time. There's an exit between between Crossville and Knoxville, the Harriman exit. I can't tell you the last time I went to Knoxville, went to Gatlinburg, went anywhere up there where I don't stop there for gas. And I don't know why. Probably because my mother did it when I was a kid. That's where we always stopped for gas. And I'm in my 30s now. If I've got 3/4 of a tank, or if I'm about empty, I'm going to stop at Harriman at that little gas station. No rhyme or reason. It's just what I've always done. And I have a time or two went past it, and it felt so weird to me. It's like it threw off my whole drive. But there are things we do, things we encounter every day that are in some way, whether we created it or somebody else did, a tradition. And there's so many things we do that somebody else created it that we have no idea why it started. We don't know what the origin was, what the purpose was, but we do it, and we just do it because we've always done it, do it because everybody else has always done it, and we don't realize, but we're following a tradition. Brother Winkler put here as the introduction of this lesson, on September 26, 1820, Robert Johnson of Salem, New Jersey, bit into a poisonous wolf peach, and to the amazement of his peers, remained unharmed. The reason? Because the traditional wolf peach was in actuality a common garden tomato. Now for me, that would have kept me from eating any more wolf peaches because I hate tomatoes. But there are some of you that loved them that probably had no idea at some point nobody had bitten into it and just assumed it was this poisonous, deadly thing. I believe I first heard this story from Brother Edward. I know I've heard it since then. I think it was you. If not, I'm sure you still heard it anyway. But there was a young couple that got married, and the wife was about to cook her first big meal for a number of people, and she was going to cook the ham, and she cut off a chunk of it and threw it away. And the husband was, "What are you doing? That's good meat. Why are you throwing it away?" And she said, "Well, that's how you cook ham." He said, "It is most certainly not how you cook ham. You cook that part too." And she said, "Well, that's how I've always cooked ham. That's how my mama cooked ham. That's how I cook ham." "Well, why'd your mama throw it away?" "Well, I don't know." So he makes her call her mother. Gets her mother on the phone. "Why do you cut off the end of the ham and throw it away?" "Well, I've just always done that. My mama did it." "Call grandma." Same thing. "Well, my mama did it. That's just how you cook ham." Finally, they call great-grandma and say, "Great-grandma, when we cook a ham, why is it that we cut off the end and throw it away?" And she said, "Well, I don't know why y'all do it, but my ham pan was too small and I had to cut off a part of it for it to fit." We do things because we've always done them. And in general, in a sense, a lot of those, they're okay. There's nothing wrong other than wasting meat, than cutting off a big chunk of ham before you cook it. There's nothing wrong with me stopping at the same gas station in Harriman every time I go to Knoxville. But there are things that we get into, that we do, that we don't realize the original meaning, and it's a challenge for us, and it gets us way off base from where we're supposed to be. A couple other small things before we get into the meat of this. I found an article, things we do every day that we don't realize started as something else. And we do them every day as part of a tradition. And if we stopped doing them, there might be repercussions, although the repercussions today have nothing to do with the origin. When we walk in, when we come to church service, what do? We shake hands. We say, "Hello, how are you?" And when we meet somebody, we shake hands. Did you know where the shaking hands comes from? It's from checking somebody's sleeve to make sure they're not carrying a weapon. That's how it originated. The best man at a wedding. You know, we think, well, that's your best friend, it's your sibling, it's somebody you're really close to. The origin of selecting a best man for the wedding, you picked somebody you knew that had the best combat skills, because it was customary in 16th century Germany for women to be kidnapped for eligible bachelors to marry. So you either had a best man to go kidnap you a wife, or you had a best man to keep somebody from kidnapping who you wanted to be your wife. Now, looking back at it now, I should have never been anybody's best man, and I probably would have picked a different one for my wedding, but it's weird to think about. Bridesmaids started as a thing because they put several young women up there dressed similarly. The thought at its origin was so evil spirits that meant to do harm to the bride would be confused as to which one was the bride. Now we look at weddings now, and I picked the best man. Hannah had bridesmaids because that's what you do for a wedding. But I had no idea of any of these things. I'm sure a lot of us have heard this one. When we sneeze or cough or yawn, we cover our mouths. But that originally started because there was a belief that when you sneezed, you left a void inside of you, and if you didn't cover up, an evil spirit would fill that void. Nowadays we do it because we don't want to sneeze on people. And if somebody sneezes without covering their mouth, we're a little disgusted by it. So we keep that tradition, but now it's just they're disgusting. It's not because there's some evil spirit that's going to enter their body. And then the last one, in so many parts of the world, America's kind of the exception, but people drive on the left-hand side of the road. And that started because when people would ride horseback, you didn't know who it was that you were passing, whether they were a friend or foe, and most people were right-handed. And if they had to defend themselves or engage in combat while riding, their right hand was free. So all these things have these origins that have now become traditions, and until I started looking some of this up, I had no idea. I'm assuming some of you had no idea. So we can get caught up in these things. Looking at the text now, and this will take me a few minutes, but comparatively it is a brief synopsis of what's going on here. In the middle of chapter 21, Paul is coming in from his third mission trip, and he's greeted by the elders, and they're kind of telling him what's been going on. Because word has got back, erroneously, but rumors have gotten back that Paul is out preaching against the Mosaical law, preaching against the traditions that Jews have followed forever. And really what Paul was doing, he was out telling the Gentiles that in order to be saved, in order to join the church, that they didn't have to adopt these Jewish traditions. But Paul was not out telling the Jews not to do them. And kind of in a way to gain favor, which we will see Paul do. We've seen Paul do a couple times in the Bible, and time permitting, we'll get back and address some of those. But in order to gain favor, Paul agrees to take the Nazirite vow, which was a Jewish tradition, in order to show the Jews in that area in Jerusalem that, hey, I'm not teaching against this. So then he goes to the temple to do so and encounters a whole other problem. Militant Jews from Asia were there, and these rumors had been going around about Paul teaching against the old faith. He was a threat to their tradition. He was trying to kill their tradition, a tradition that they loved, customs that they thought were necessary, even though they had been taught otherwise. But so Paul comes, and he's been seen with Trophimus, and I may be saying that name completely wrong, but Trophimus the Gentile. He had been seen in the city, and these Jews had assumed, again, erroneously, that Paul had brought this Gentile into the inner parts of the temple. Now, the way the temple was constructed at the time is there was an inner court where Jewish men went to make their sacrifices. It was considered the most holy part. But then, kind of on the perimeter of that was what was called the Court of Women, which is where the Jewish families went to worship and to pray. And then outside of that was the Gentile court, where anyone who believed could come worship and pray. However, if a Gentile breached into one of those inner parts, that was a big no-no. It was a big violation. It was punishable even to death. And the Romans who were overseeing it, in order to keep peace with the Jews, oftentimes allowed this to happen. So they thought Paul had brought this Gentile into where he shouldn't have been and broken their tradition. And it angered them so much that they attacked Paul. And they beat Paul. And if it had not been from the interference from Roman soldiers, would have killed Paul right there. But the Roman commander saw this going on, sent soldiers to break it up. And Paul asked the commander if he could address the crowd. And he allowed him to. And Paul starts speaking to them in Hebrew, which is their language, and they're listening to every word. And I don't know, we're not told if they think he's trying to talk his way out of it, if they believe him, but they're listening. It says they were silent. In chapter 22 and verse 1, and when they heard he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. Listening to Paul's address here, where he's talking about his education at the feet of Gamaliel, his convictions to the old law, his dedication as a persecutor of the church at one time, but then his conversion, and then his commission to go out and spread the gospel. And they were hanging on every word until, in verse 21, then he said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. And they listened to him until this word, and then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live. Gentile. He said that word. The rage came back. Again, he's threatening our traditions. He's trying to kill our traditions. And they conspired to kill him. There were 40 men that made a plot that the next day they were going to kill Paul for threatening their traditions. But the commander saw this was happening. Word had gotten to Paul and then to the commander that, hey, these guys are going to kill him. So he sent him in secret in the night, surrounded by guards, to Caesarea, to the governor of Judea, who at the time was Felix. Sent him in secret. About 5 days later, Ananias the high priest and the elders came to Caesarea and brought with them Tertullus, who's described as an orator, but basically seems like a prosecutor, there to lay out the charges. And Paul is basically on trial in front of Felix here. Charges against him were creating dissension among the Jews. They said he was a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Said he tried to profane the temple and that he violated their traditions as one to be judged by their law. Paul, in his own defense, pointed out that he had only been there 12 days, that probably wasn't long enough to cause a dissension, that his association with the sect that they were speaking of, which was the church, was actually based on teachings in the old law, which was written in the law and in the prophets. He pointed out that he was purifying himself in the temple, not desecrating it, and that his accusers were actually disobeying the law by not being present with their accusations. So Felix, who's judging this matter, finds nothing wrong with Paul, finds no reason that Paul should be punished, no reason Paul should be put to death, but Felix, not really wanting to upset the Jews, sat on it. Didn't make a decision. And Felix is described we're in chapter 24 now, verse 22, as one that had a more accurate knowledge of the way. And there are probably a couple factors into why that is. His wife, Drusilla, was actually the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great, who tried to kill Jesus as a baby. She was the niece of Herod, who killed John the Baptist, and her father was the one who had the apostle James put to death. So when you look at that, and then you also look at the fact that Felix had governed over Judea and Samaria probably about 6 years at this point, he was probably fairly familiar with what had been going on, and sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And Paul, in talking, is basically, he's teaching Felix and Drusilla the gospel. He's teaching them in this opportunity. But it says that as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, that Felix was afraid. And the reason why Felix more than likely was afraid, historically, by what Paul was teaching him, was because Drusilla was actually Felix's third wife. And if what I read that was found online, that if it was true, I don't know the 100% truth of this, but I believe that Felix was her third husband. And the fact that Felix had seduced her away from her previous husband, if Paul is preaching to them the gospel, probably not what he wanted to hear in certain parts. And again, when we get used to doing something the way we're doing it, we're not likely to change our mind. And from what we can tell, Felix didn't change his mind, and he had that famous now quote about a more convenient time, because the way he was living, it was not convenient for him to believe what Paul was telling him. And there was also the fact that Felix thought that at some point somebody would come pay him to let Paul go. He thought he might get a bribe in that situation, but Felix was removed as governor about 2 years later without ever making a decision on Paul. Felix was removed, Festus takes over. And Festus inherits basically this political hot potato with Paul. And the Jews requested Festus to send Paul back to Jerusalem. But again, because of a tradition, maybe for the first time in a good way in these passages, because it wasn't a custom to send a man to his destruction without facing his accusers, Festus made the Jews come to Caesarea. But Paul was basically put on trial again, defended himself again. But again, Festus, the consummate politician, didn't want to upset the Jews. So again, he this time he asked Paul to go back to Jerusalem. But Paul, being a Roman citizen, refused and appealed to Caesar because he had that right as a Roman citizen. And we see there's so much more here, and I'm kind of going to cut this short because this brief synopsis is getting not so brief. But again, go back and read the whole book of Acts, but read these latter few chapters when you get a chance. But I am going to skip ahead to chapter 28. When Paul finally does get to Rome after many travels and a shipwreck later, he calls for the leaders of the Jews to meet with him. And they haven't heard about any of his struggles. That word has not gotten to him that he's done these great things. They'd heard nothing of his conflicts, but they wanted to know about the sect that had been spoken against everywhere, which was the church. And at that point, Paul, again, basically teach to them the gospel. And the differing of how these people received it, some of them believed, some, for probably several at least, because they were so set in the Jewish traditions and what the old law had taught, didn't believe him, and they were kind of split when they left there. Brother Winkler's book, there's a little section here called When Tradition Replaces Truth as One's Authority. And it talks about the consequences that happened in these chapters. And it says, some listened to hearsay and thought that Paul believed and taught things which he did not. Some jumped to conclusions and mistakenly thought that Paul had defiled the temple. Some gendered suspicion, causing the Romans to even think of Paul as a religious terrorist. Some were closed-minded, listening to Paul until he mentioned the word Gentiles. Some acted like wild animals when their traditions were threatened. Some were so protective of their traditions that they became spiritual vigilantes. And then some played dirty politics, slung mud, and called Paul a plague in trying to preserve their traditions. Stepping away from Acts for a minute, but staying with Paul. Tradition, at least right here, is not the first time and the only time Paul ever dealt with people who were entrenched in their traditions. We see in Galatians chapter 4, starting in verse 8, but then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not gods. But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. Here we see Paul writing to the churches in Galatia that expressing his concern that now that they've become the church, they've converted, they're Christians, but they're still doing what they used to do in some areas. Specifically, they're observing certain days that they did before because they've always done it. But notice here that Paul doesn't say that their practice was wrong per se, only that he's concerned. But I think it's pretty easy to tell from context that his concern pertained to why they were doing these things. Because if they believed that these things they were doing were part of what they were to do as Christians, if they believed that what they were doing was necessary to worship God, if they believed what they were doing was necessary to their salvation, then Paul was worried, because at that point all the labor he had done with and for them would have been for nothing. For seeking justification through the law, it causes one, we see in Galatians 5 and verse 4, to fall from grace and become estranged from Christ. You have become estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. And we also see Paul in Colossians chapter 2, while speaking to the Gentiles. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. Some were seeking, as earlier in Acts that I'm sure has already been covered, but some people were seeking to bind the law, the old law, the Mosaic law, on Gentiles when they were being converted. And here Paul's telling them no. And it's that teaching that got misconstrued and got back to the Jews in Jerusalem that, hey, he's preaching against the old law. But Gentile Christians here were told not to let anyone judge or condemn them, for salvation is in Christ, not in the keeping of these traditions. But, as I noted before, and as we saw before, there's several instances where Paul is not averse to following some of these Jewish traditions, even after his conversion. He didn't hesitate to keep Jewish customs when it was expedient. Acts 16, he had Timothy be circumcised. He sought to keep a Jewish feast in Jerusalem in Acts 18, as we saw earlier. He took a Nazirite vow in order to gain favor or appease these Jews. And I think the reason that he's doing this, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, but when you're trying to talk with someone, maybe it's about the gospel, maybe it's just about something else, but they don't agree with you and they assume that you're against what they're saying. If you're on somebody's bad side, how likely is it that they're going to listen to what you're saying? I went to doing something, I don't even remember exactly what I was doing, but I was in downtown Nashville several months ago now. And there were a couple people with megaphones and loudspeakers that were preaching. But they were so hateful to people walking by. People walking by, and they're telling them they're sinners and shouting it and telling them they're all going to hell and yada, yada, yada. And I was with somebody who's not a member of the church, but I looked at him and I said, how many people do you think they're going to convert with that approach? Maybe I'm wrong, and it works, but I've never seen one of those people with any success, at least not that I've seen. I know from a personal standpoint, there's that old saying, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. A lot of times if you're on somebody's bad side, if they have that perception of you, odds are they're probably not going to listen to what you're saying. And I think that had a lot to do with why Paul did these things. However, in his teaching, and write these verses down, I'm not going to be able to go through them time-wise. I had a lot more material than I thought I did. But in his teaching, he made it clear that keeping these observations, in Romans 14, just write down that whole chapter. It goes well with this. But in Romans 14, Paul makes it clear that these should be kept on an individual basis. Galatians chapter 2, 3 through 5, that it shouldn't be bound upon others. And most importantly, going back to Galatians 5, 4 through 6, it was clear in his teaching that these things had absolutely nothing to do with our justification in Christ. Where Paul drew the line here was in making matters doctrine. making them, keeping these traditions as part of someone's salvation. And the last thing we'll hit, again, like I said, I didn't get through near as much material as I thought I would, but we look at things today, and I actually did a lesson on this a few months ago, well, Easter Sunday, about Easter, and how Easter has come to be what it is now. The day that so many people celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, what in the world does that have to do with a bunny and colored eggs? And I actually went back and found the history, and what happened was basically a whole bunch of different things came together. Easter started off as basically this spring holiday for pagans. The Passover became, after Jesus' death and the apostles were gone, the Passover kind of became a yearly remembrance of Jesus' death. And then when the gospel was taught to those pagans, the pagans kept some of their Easter and mixed this in. And originally eggs were dyed red to commemorate Jesus' blood. So many things, and then you fast forward a couple thousand years later, and everybody, a whole lot more people than any other day of the year, celebrate Jesus' resurrection that day. And then they take their kids to go see the Easter Bunny, and the kids go hunt eggs. And vast majority of people, again, because I had no idea, have no idea that started as kind of a pagan holiday, and it turned into what it is. There's so many things that people do and observe now that they don't know why they're doing it. They've just always done it. And we, at times, are the same way, and a lot of times it's not a big deal. And the big point I wanted to make from that lesson that I had done was that you look at these things and you think, it's kind of common practice now when a male child is born, not long after they're circumcised. Does it have anything to do with keeping the old law? No. It's a hygiene thing now. It's a health thing. Many of us, as Christians, let our children hunt eggs at Easter, go trick-or-treating on Halloween. And these started as these pagan holidays, these pagan deals. Is it wrong for us to do that? And I think much like Paul had said, it's all in why you're doing it. Are we doing it because we're celebrating this pagan holiday and why it started? No. We like to see our kids happy. We like to see our kids pick up eggs. We like to see our kids bring home a lot of candy and pay the dad tax. So that's why we do it. But traditions can be a hindrance to the church. They can be a hindrance to us. We just have to keep in mind, just because we've always done something, why are we doing it? Thank you so much for your attention.